Hello again. We're going to go a little bit deeper in our discussion of the cell membrane. So you should have watched a video talking about the cell, the different parts of the cell. I want to talk more specifically about the cell membrane. And the reason is we're going to cover transport, how things move across the membrane. So we need to know what the membrane is made up of so that we can then understand how we can get things to move across it. So the plasma membrane, if you'll remember, is a bilayer, and it's a bilayer made up of phospholipids. And phospholipids are one of those types of fats we've talked about before, and this is what they look like. And they have a head and a tail region. This will be the head, and this will be the tail. And the head is considered hydrophilic or water-loving, whereas the tail is hydrophobic or water-fearing. And so the way they orient, the heads are water-loving. So remember, the outside of the cell is watery, the extracellular fluid. The inside of the cell is watery, the intracellular fluid. So those heads orient so that they love or face the water. The tails, because they're water-fearing, they line up on the inside. So you get this bilayer of phospholipids. So that's what the membrane looks like. And associated with that membrane, you have these proteins, and we'll talk about these proteins in the next part of this talk. So the plasma membrane is what's called a fluid mosaic. It's a flexible membrane, and it's got these phospholipids, and it's got these proteins, and all this is just kind of floating. These proteins can kind of float through this membrane. They stay in the membrane, but it's not rigid like a cell wall. And so when you think about the plasma membrane, it's going to have the phospholipids, it's going to have all kind of proteins. You're going to have some things called integral proteins and some peripheral proteins. An integral protein is something that would go like all the way through, or it's kind of on the inside, whereas a peripheral protein is something that's kind of on the outside layer. So kind of outside the membrane. So if it's inside the membrane or crossing the membrane, it's an integral protein. If it's kind of on the edges, it will be a peripheral protein. And these proteins have many different jobs. These proteins can be receptors. They may have some kind of a glycolipid or a glycoprotein attached to them. They can act like receptors. They can act for cell-to-cell signaling. So they have many, many different jobs. So these proteins can act as channels. They can allow things to move in and out of the cell. They can be a place for enzyme activity. So we're going to talk about a lot of different cell membrane proteins as we move through the semester. But this is just an example of what they would look like and some different kinds. You'll also see some cholesterol molecules associated with the plasma membrane. Okay, and your plasma membrane is selectively permeable. That means it allows some things to cross and some things are blocked, or they have to be carried across. So things that can freely cross the membrane, that can just diffuse, we're going to use the word diffusion here soon, that can freely cross the membrane are some hydrophobic molecules, things like water, oxygen, carbon dioxide, things that are uncharged, alcohol. All of these can freely move across the membrane. So oxygen, so when you breathe in oxygen and it's in your blood and it's going in and out of your cells, oxygen can freely just move across the membrane. And we're going to talk about how that works. So we're going to talk about some different types of transport later, but just understand now that these things can freely go across the membrane. Things that can't move freely across the membrane are things that are hydrophilic, like amino acids and sugars and nucleotides. Charged molecules like ions, things that have charges. Big organic molecules, large, they're too big to go across the membrane freely. So a lot of times when something has to be, that needs to get inside the cell that can't freely cross the membrane, it has to be transported into the membrane or across the membrane. And we're going to talk about different types of membrane transport in the next video. When you're talking about membrane transport, you're talking about many times a protein. It may be a channel that basically is like a pore. It's a hole in the membrane that allows things to move through it. It may actually transport it, physically grab it and move it across. So there's all kinds of proteins in the membrane that can allow you to move things across the membrane that aren't freely permeable. All right, so your plasma membrane is selectively permeable, and this is real important. This is going to be a concept that we need to understand as we talk about water balance. We're going to talk about how do we regulate the amount of water and sodium and chloride and potassium in our body. And part of that, that phospholipid bilayer being selectively permeable plays a role in allowing us to balance how much water, sodium chloride, potassium we have inside our cell and outside our cell. So we're going to go into more detail in that in some later videos. I just want to set you up now with what the plasma membrane looks like, what it's made up of, and introduce that topic. I'll see you in the next video.